Welcome back to Tales Told by Peace. Today, we have a story that I believe will truly inspire you to look for the good in the world. Before we begin, kindly hit the subscribe button and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. It truly motivates us to keep sharing more amazing stories with you.
The harmattan of that year did not just bring dust. It brought a silence so thick it felt like wool in the throat. In the weaving village of Iseyin, where the rhythmic clack-clack of the horizontal looms usually served as the heartbeat of the land, Efe's workshop was a tomb. Efe sat on his low wooden stool, his fingers calloused but idle. Before him sat a loom of seasoned Iroko wood, its heddles empty, its warp beams bone dry. In Nigeria, a man is measured by the strength of his back and the fruit of his labor. But Efe's back was bent by death, and his labor had withered like a scorched yam vine. He was a master of the asoke, yet he had no money for cotton, no credit for silk, and his reputation was fading faster than cheap dye in the afternoon sun. A man who waits for a roasted bird to fly into his mouth will wait until his teeth fall out, he whispered to the empty room, a bitter proverb he had heard his father say. But even his father hadn't foreseen a season where the rains refused to stop and the merchants refused to trust. That night, the sky over Oyo State cracked open. It wasn't a normal rain, it was a celestial tantrum. Thunder rolled like heavy boulders across a zinc roof, and the wind howled with the voices of 1,000 displaced spirits. Efe was barring his door with a heavy timber when he heard it, a sound thinner than a whistle, sharper than a needle, a cry. He threw open the door. The world was a sheet of grey water. There, collapsed against the mud brick wall of his workshop, was a figure so frail she looked like a bundle of discarded rags. It was an old woman, her skin the color of parched earth, her clothes soaked through to her brittle bones. But it was her hair that caught the flash of the lightning, long, matted, and shockingly white, shimmering with an unnatural metallic luminescence even in the gloom. Efe did not hesitate. Despite his own hunger, despite the whispers in the village that the forest was full of abiku and shapeshifters during such storms, he lifted her. She was impossibly light, as if her bones were hollowed out like bamboo. "Enter, Mama," he grunted, carrying her to the small hearth where a single coal struggled to stay alive. The storm does not care for age, but this roof still holds. He wrapped her in his last piece of unsold cloth, a coarse indigo-dyed wrap, and fed her a bowl of watery gari. She did not speak. Her eyes, clouded with the cataracts of a century, followed his movements with a terrifying intensity. As she grew warm, the metallic scent of ozone and ancient rain filled the room. "I have nothing to give a guest but a dry floor," Efe apologized, looking at his barren looms. "The thread is gone, Mama. The weavers of Iseyin have forgotten my name." The old woman reached out a trembling hand and touched the frame of the empty loom. Her fingers left a faint silvery streak on the wood. "A kindness in the storm is a seed planted in the heavens," she rasped. Her voice sounded like silk rubbing against silk. "Sleep, son of a weaver. The dawn brings a different hunger." Efe fell into a heavy, dreamless sleep on his mat, lulled by the subsiding rain. But in the deep hollow of the night, a new sound began. Whee, click, slide. It was the sound of a loom in motion, but it was too fast, too fluid. It sounded like a mountain stream rushing over smooth pebbles. Efe stirred in his sleep, smelling something exquisite, the scent of night-blooming jasmine and hot metal. When the first light of the Nigerian sun pierced the dusty windows the next morning, Efe awoke to a transformed world. The old woman, now called Mama Silva by his heart, sat by the hearth, her head bowed, but it was the loom that drew his scream. Strung across the Iroko frame was a warp of impossible beauty. It wasn't cotton, it wasn't the silk brought by the caravans from the north. It was a fabric that defied the eye, a shimmering liquid silver that seemed to hold the moonlight captive within its threads. It glowed with a soft, rhythmic pulse. Efe approached it with trembling hands. He touched the fabric. It was cooler than a clay pot buried in the shade, smoother than a polished river stone. "Where did this come from?" he gasped, turning to the old woman. "I bought no thread. There is no market in all of Lagos or Kano that sells such brilliance." Mama Silva looked up. Her hair, once a wild mane of white, seemed slightly shorter, though it still shone with that strange ethereal light. She gave a small, weary smile. "The thread is a gift of the blood and the breath," she whispered. "Sell it, Ife. Pay your debts, feed the hungry, but remember, the weaver's price is never paid in coins, but in the keeping of the heart." Ife took the bolt of silver silk to the marketplace that afternoon. By sunset, the news had traveled from the stalls of the spice sellers to the palaces of the elders. A young man who was a beggar yesterday was now the guardian of a miracle. As he clutched a heavy purse of naira, his heart hammering against his ribs, he looked back at his workshop. He felt a surge of triumph, a warmth he hadn't felt in years. He promised himself he would treat the old woman like a queen. He would be the greatest merchant Nigeria had ever seen. He did not notice that as he walked, a single silver thread was snagged on his sleeve, pulling taut, connecting his heartbeat to the silent woman waiting in the shadows of his home.
The transformation of Efe's life was as sudden as a harmattan fire. Within 3 moons, the dusty workshop in Iseyin had become a sanctuary of opulence. The sagging thatch was replaced with bright aluminium roofing that glinted in the sun, and the mud walls were plastered and painted the color of a ripening mango. Efe no longer wore the faded buba of a struggling laborer. He moved through the marketplace in flowing agbada made of the finest brocade, his neck adorned with coral beads that rattled like the promises of a wealthy man. He was no longer just Efe, he was Olowo, the owner of money. Yet, the source of his wealth remained shrouded in the heavy scent of night-blooming jasmine that now perpetually hung over his home. Every evening, when the village elders gathered to drink palm wine and the children were tucked under mosquito nets, Efe would lock the heavy Iroko door of his inner chamber. Inside, the silent weaver sat. Mama Silva had grown even thinner, her skin clinging to her frame like parchment, but her hands moved with a terrifying rhythmic grace. Efe had finally seen the secret. He had crept in one night, his breath held tight, and watched from the shadows. Mama Silva did not reach for a basket of silk or a spindle of cotton. Instead, she took a strand of her own glowing metallic hair. With a sharp, rhythmic tug, she pulled it from her scalp, not with a cry of pain, but with a low, melodic hum. As the hair met the loom, it expanded, shimmering and multiplying into the ethereal thread that had made Efe the envy of the Western region. "It is a sacrifice," Efe had whispered to himself that night, a cold shiver tracing his spine. But by morning, when he saw the stacks of silver silk ready for the Lagos merchants, the shiver was replaced by the heat of calculation. The turning point arrived on a Tuesday, a day the market was screaming with the haggling of thousands. A motorcade of black SUVs, kicking up plumes of red dust, pulled up to Efe's gates. Out stepped the royal envoy of a powerful northern emir, a man whose shadow was as long as his influence. "The prince is to wed the daughter of a billionaire," the envoy announced, his voice booming like a talking drum. "We have heard of the fabric of the moon. We require 50 bolts, not 30, not 40, 50, and they must be ready in 14 days for the traditional ceremony." Efe's heart did a frantic dance. 50 bolts? It was an impossible task. Mama Silva usually produced 1 bolt every 3 nights, and even then she emerged from the room trembling, her breath ragged. "The price is no object," the envoy continued, snapping his fingers. An assistant opened a briefcase. It was filled with stacks of crisp purple 1,000 naira notes, and beside them, a heavy gold chain intended as a deposit. "But if the looms are empty on the 14th day," The emir does not take disappointment lightly. Your reputation and perhaps your beautiful new roof will vanish. That night, Efe entered the inner chamber not with a bowl of food, but with a heavy heart turned to stone. "Mama," he said, his voice hard, "the royals have come. We need 50 boats in 2 weeks." The old woman looked up. Her head was now mostly bare, her skin beneath her few remaining silver strands bruised and grey. Her eyes, which once were sharp, were sinking into her skull. "The thread, it comes from the soul's well, Efe," she rasped. "The well is running dry. To weave faster is to bleed the spirit. You fed from my table when the storm would have eaten you. Is this how you repay the man who gave you a roof? Weave, use both looms, sleep less. The world is watching me." He did not wait for her answer. He turned the key in the lock, the heavy click echoing like his sentence. For the next 10 days, the clack, clack, clack of the loom did not stop. It became a frantic, desperate heartbeat that pulsed through the walls. Efe paced outside, counting the days, his mind already building a mansion in Ikoyi with the promised gold. On the 12th night, the sound changed. It was no longer a rhythmic song. It was a wet, tearing sound punctuated by a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. Efe stood by the door, his hand on the key. He felt a sudden sharp tug in his own chest, a phantom thread pulling at his very ribs. "Just 2 more days," he muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. "Just 2 more boats and I am a king forever." He did not realize that the merchant prince was no longer weaving a fortune, but a shroud.
The 14th day arrived not with his sunrise, but with a suffocating heat that seemed to bake the very air of Iseyin. The village was restless. The dust of the motorcade could already be seen rising like a storm on the horizon. The emir's men were coming. Efe stood before the heavy Iroko door, his hands trembling. For the last 48 hours, the room had been deathly silent. No whirring of the shuttle, no rhythmic hum, not even the sound of a labored breath. "Mana," he whispered, his voice cracking, "the envoy is at the village gate. Is the work finished?" Silence was his only answer. Panicked, Efe jammed the iron key into the lock and threw the door open. The air inside hit him like a physical blow. It smelled of ozone, dry earth, and something metallic, like blood on a blade. The room was blinding. 50 bolts of silver silk sat stacked against the wall, radiating a light so pure it made the morning sun look dim. They were more than fabric. They were masterpieces of celestial geometry. But his eyes quickly darted to the loom. Mama Silva was gone. In her place, draped over the Iroko frame, was a final 51st garment. It was a royal agbada of such intricate detail that the pattern seemed to move, shifting like the surface of a river. But as Efe stepped closer, his heart turned to lead. The loom was stained. A dark, translucent sap, the color of a bruised twilight, covered the wood. There were no silver hairs left on the floor. The woman had woven herself into the very last thread. "Mama," he called out, his voice small. He touched the final garment. The moment his skin met the silver thread, the moral catch snapped shut. The fabric didn't feel like silk. It felt like a predator. The silver threads began to vibrate, emitting a low, mournful frequency that rattled Efe's teeth. He tried to pull his hand away, but the thread had snagged on his fine coral beads. With a violent jerk, the beads shattered, scattering across the floor like drops of blood. The silver thread began to unravel, not from the garment, but from him. Efe watched in horror as the fine lines of his own palms began to glow. The supernatural death was calling for its interest. The greed that had prompted him to lock the door created a vacuum that only his own essence could fill. The thread began to draw the vitality from his limbs, spinning it into a translucent, shimmering cord that fed back into the loom. "No! Gods! Help me!" he screamed, but his voice was becoming thin, airy like the rustle of dry leaves. When the royal envoy burst into the room minutes later, his eyes widened at the sight of the 50 bolts of shimmering silk. Incredible!
the envoy breathed, stepping over the scattered coral beads. The emir will be pleased. This is wealth beyond counting. He looked toward the loom, where a final exquisite robe hung. And is this for the prince himself? The envoy reached out, but he paused. The room was empty of people. There was only a lingering scent of night-blooming jasmine and a single tattered indigo wrap, the one Efe had used to cover the old woman on the night of the storm, lying abandoned on the floor. Beside the loom, a new stool had appeared, carved from a wood that looked suspiciously like the bones of a man. And though the room was still, the heddles of the loom began to move with a slow, ghostly clack-clack. Efe was gone, but the mystery of the silent weaver remained. In the years that followed, the people of Iseyin told a new story. They spoke of the merchant prince who disappeared on the day of his greatest triumph. They whispered that if you pass a certain house on a stormy night, you can hear a loom walking in the dark, weaving a silver thread that never ends for a debt that can never be paid. As the elders say, the man who eats the seeds of his future to satisfy the hunger of his pride will find that his stomach is full, but his life is empty.